Stand on the shore of East Anglia with me, in the autumn of the year 865. Ships are beaching on the mudflats, dozens of them, hulls scraping against the shallows, warriors wading out into the cold water before the tide even finishes retreating. You have seen this before. Every coastal community in Britain has seen this before, for the better part of a century now. Raiders come in summer, take what they can carry, and leave before anyone can organize a response. It is a pattern. It is almost, in its terrible way, something you have learned to survive. Except these ships are not leaving. As the weeks pass and the season turns toward winter, the warriors on this beach are still here, and more are arriving, and something in the rhythm of raid and retreat that has governed this coastline for generations has quietly, permanently broken. What happens when the raiders stop going home? If that question unsettles you the way it should, subscribe now, because we are about to spend the next half hour answering it in full, and there is nowhere else that will give you both the drama and the discipline this story deserves. For nearly a century before this beach, before this autumn, Viking raids on Britain had followed a predictable, if terrifying, shape. Small fleets, coastal monasteries and market towns. Take the silver, take the captives, burn what cannot be carried, and be gone with the tide before any king's forces could muster a response. It was profitable. It was also, from a strategic standpoint, limited. A raid extracts wealth. It does not hold territory. What arrived in East Anglia in 865 was something categorically different, and the sources that describe it agree on this if nothing else. This was not a raiding party. This was a force with conquest in mind, and with it came an intention no previous Viking force operating in Britain had shown at this scale: to stay. Later tradition gives this army a leadership drawn from legend. 3 brothers, Ivar, Halfdan and Ubba, said to be sons of a semi-legendary Norse figure named Ragnar Lodbrok. We should be honest with you about how solid that connection actually is, because it matters. Historians studying Ragnar Lodbrok have found a figure whose surviving stories are almost certainly a composite. Pieces of several different historical men stitched together over generations of saga, telling into one legendary father figure, embellished for narrative satisfaction rather than preserved as documented fact. The idea that this invasion was at its heart an act of filial revenge for a father's death is a story that comes to us primarily through later Norse literary tradition, not from anything closer to the events themselves. It is a compelling narrative. It is not something we can hand you as settled history. What we can tell you with more confidence is this: the actual motive behind the invasion was almost certainly more practical than vengeance. Land, wealth, opportunity arriving at the exact moment several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were too divided, too distracted, or too weak to mount a unified defence. That is a less romantic story than a son avenging his father. It is very likely the true one. The army's first move was not conquest, at least not yet. East Anglia, the kingdom whose coastline this force had landed on, chose the same solution kings across Britain had leaned on for decades: pay them to leave you alone. Over the winter of 865 into 866, East Anglia bought the Vikings off, and the payment took an unusual and telling form: horses. Consider what that single detail actually tells you about what was coming. This was not a fleet planning to load its ships with silver and sail home. This was a force preparing to move overland, deep into the island, at speed, unbound by coastline or tide. The horses were not tribute in the ordinary sense. They were the tool that would let this army strike faster and further than any previous Viking force in Britain's history had managed, and East Anglia had, unknowingly, just funded the very mobility that would soon be turned against its neighbours. By the end of 866, the army moved north, toward the kingdom of Northumbria, and toward a city whose defences had decayed, and whose leadership was, at the exact moment it needed unity most, tearing itself apart. Northumbria in 866 was in the middle of a civil war. A man named Ælla had driven out the previous king, Osbert, by force, and the kingdom now had 2 rival claimants to its throne rather than one functioning government. This is worth sitting with, because it is not an incidental detail. It is close to the entire explanation for what happened next. On the 1st of November 866, the Great Heathen Army captured York, walking into a city whose walls had crumbled through neglect, and whose defenders had spent recent months fighting each other rather than preparing for an external threat. This was not chaos. This was policy, in the sense that matters most here, not the Vikings' policy, but Northumbria's own failure of policy, Its own inability to set aside an internal power struggle, even as an army with conquest on its mind marched toward the kingdom's most important city. Only once York had already fallen did Ælla and Osbert set aside their rivalry. In the spring of 867, the two rival kings finally united their forces and marched to retake the city. On the 21st of March they met the Viking army in battle at York itself, and the result was total defeat. Both kings, Ælla and Osbert, died in the fighting. An entire kingdom's leadership destroyed in a single afternoon, in a battle that might never have needed to happen at all if the two men had found unity 3 years earlier instead of 3 weeks too late. Here is where we need to correct one of the most persistent myths attached to this entire war. Later Norse saga tradition tells a gruesome story about what happened to Ælla, that the victorious Ivar and his brother captured him after the battle and executed him using a ritual called the Blood Eagle, a mutilation so specific and so horrifying that it has become one of the most quoted details in popular Viking storytelling. It is also almost certainly invented. The contemporary sources closest to the actual events tell a far plainer story. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle simply records that both kings were slain on the spot. The Irish Annals of Ulster, another near-contemporary source, describes Ælla falling in the battle itself, using language that in context indicates death in combat, not a staged ritual execution afterward. The Blood Eagle story appears only in much later Icelandic sagas, composed generations after the events they describe, in a literary tradition that prized dramatic, memorable violence in its storytelling. We are not telling you Ælla died peacefully. We are telling you he almost certainly died as a defeated king dies on a battlefield, not as the victim of an elaborate ritual invented by storytellers who never met him. With Northumbria's leadership destroyed, the Viking army installed a puppet ruler named Ecbert to govern in their interest, a client king with a crown but no independent authority, and this arrangement held until a revolt drove him into exile roughly 5 years later. One kingdom had fallen, and it had taken the Vikings barely 2 years to do it. If you are starting to see the pattern here, political division, exploited ruthlessly, turning what should have been a defensible island into a chain of falling dominoes, you are seeing exactly what this channel exists to show you clearly. Our members get more of this pattern-level analysis first, the connective tissue between individual battles that most history content skips past. It's there whenever you want to go deeper with us. It is also worth asking, briefly, why this shift from raiding to conquest happened at all in this particular decade, rather than 50 years earlier or 50 years later. Historians point to pressures building within Scandinavia itself, population growth straining available farmland, and a political culture where younger sons and ambitious warlords without secure inheritance had every incentive to seek land and status abroad, rather than compete for a shrinking supply at home. Raiding had always offered plunder. What changed by the 860s was that a large enough coalition of men without land to lose finally looked at the fractured, feuding kingdoms of Britain and calculated that conquest was not just possible, but achievable. The Great Heathen Army was not a single unified nation's invasion force. It was closer to a coalition of opportunists, bound together by shared advantage rather than a single crown, which is part of why it could move so fluidly between targets, and why its component parts would eventually go their separate ways once the conquest was largely complete. Ivar himself is a case in point. After the York campaign and the early conquest of East Anglia, he all but disappears from the English record after 870, and historians have spent considerable effort trying to work out where he went next, with some proposing he is the same figure as a Viking king, recorded ruling in Dublin around the same period, though the identification remains debated rather than settled. Hafton, by contrast, stayed the course in the north. In 876, having secured Northumbria, he began dividing the conquered land among his own followers, allotting farms and settlements to men who had fought under him, the literal, physical beginning of what would come to be called the Danelaw, the swath of eastern and northern England where Scandinavian settlers' law and place names would remain embedded for generations, long after the war itself had ended. Conquest, in other words, was only the first half of what this campaign achieved. Settlement was the second, and in the long run it left a deeper mark on the shape of England than any single battle in this story did. Northumbria subdued, the army turned toward Mercia, the great Midland kingdom, and in 867 captured Nottingham. Mercia's King Burgred did not stay to fight to the end. He fled overseas, abandoning his kingdom rather than risk the fate that had just befallen Ælla and Osbert. In his place, the Vikings installed another client ruler, a man named Ceolwulf, whom the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written, remember, by the eventual winners of this long war, describes with open contempt, calling him nothing more than a foolish king's thing. Two kingdoms, Northumbria and now effectively Mercia, were no longer independent in any meaningful sense. Both now answered, one way or another, to the army that had landed on an East Anglian beach barely 3 years earlier. And East Anglia itself, the kingdom that had paid this army off with horses in 865, believing it had bought itself safety, discovered in 869 that safety bought with silver, and horses was never anything more than a postponement. The Viking army returned that year, and this time there was no interest in another payoff. This was conquest, plain and direct. The decisive battle, fought most likely near Thetford, ended in a crushing defeat for the East Anglian forces. Their King Edmund was captured, and shortly afterward he was killed. What happened to Edmund in the years and centuries after his death is almost as important to this story as what happened to him on the day he actually died, because his death was transformed quite deliberately into something else entirely. Later hagiography, the literature written to build the case for a dead ruler's sainthood, embellished Edmund's execution into an elaborate martyrdom, bound to a tree, shot through with arrows in a scene deliberately evoking earlier Christian martyrs, offered the chance to renounce his faith and refusing even as the arrows struck him. It is a powerful image, and it built Edmund a lasting religious cult that persists in English tradition to this day. It is also almost certainly not a reliable account of what actually happened on the day of his death. The earliest and most reliable sources simply record that Edmund was defeated in battle and subsequently killed, the fate of a captured king in a war with no interest in ransoming him. The arrows and refusal story came later, shaped by the needs of sainthood rather than the discipline of history. We tell you both versions, and we tell you plainly which one the evidence actually supports. 3 kingdoms, then. Northumbria, Mercia, and now East Anglia, each brought under Viking control or client rule within the space of roughly 5 years. Only Wessex in the south remained. We are not going to walk you through what happened in Wessex in the years that followed, the desperate resistance under a young king named Alfred, his low point hiding in the marshes at Athelney, his eventual victory at the Battle of Edington in 878 that finally checked this army's advance. We have already told that story in full in this channel's video on Alfred the Great, and we would rather send you there to watch it properly than compress it badly here as an afterthought. What matters for this story is simpler. By the early 870s, this single army, or its splintered successor forces, had brought 3 of 4 English kingdoms to their knees, and the 4th was fighting for its life. There is one more piece of physical evidence that grounds this entire war in something more solid than chronicle entries and saga embellishment, and it comes from a small village called Repton in Derbyshire. Archaeological excavation at Repton, carried out across multiple seasons since the 1970s, uncovered a D-shaped defensive enclosure on a riverbank, almost certainly the remains of a fortified winter camp. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle entries describe the Viking army wintering at Repton in 873 and 874, and for years the physical dating evidence at the site seemed inconsistent with that timeline. More recent analysis, using improved radiocarbon techniques that account for a marine and freshwater dietary effect that had previously skewed the dates, has confirmed what the written sources always claimed. This was indeed a Viking camp of the correct period. Alongside the camp, excavators found a mass grave containing the remains of at least 264 individuals. Roughly 80% were male, aged between 15 and 45, and many show clear signs of violent, weapon-inflicted trauma. This is not a chronicle entry or a saga's dramatic flourish. This is bone, buried in the ground for over 1,000 years, still carrying the marks of the war it was part of. We should be careful, though, about what this grave definitively proves. Not every death represented in it can be confidently attributed to combat. Researchers studying the site have raised the genuine possibility that some portion of these deaths came not from battle wounds but from disease, an epidemic moving through a crowded winter camp the way disease moved through every army in this period, Viking or Anglo-Saxon alike. The honest answer is that this mass grave records a war's cost, but not a clean, uncomplicated one. Some of these men very likely died fighting. Some of them may simply have died from what happens when hundreds of people are forced to winter together in close, unsanitary conditions. Both are part of the same war's true toll. There is a final correction we owe you. and it is about the name this war carries into modern memory, the Great Heathen Army. The word great has, over centuries of retelling, encouraged an image of overwhelming numbers, tens of thousands of warriors sweeping across Britain by sheer weight of force. Modern historians studying the logistics of Viking Age warfare, the archaeology of camps like Repton, and the practical limits of feeding and transporting a Viking Age army now generally favour a much smaller estimate, likely a force numbering in the low thousands, not the tens of thousands popular imagination assigns it. What made this army so devastating was not its size. It was its mobility, purchased in East Anglian horses. It was its willingness to exploit political division the moment it appeared, at York and everywhere else it struck. And it was the staggering, repeated failure of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to set aside internal rivalry, even when an external force with conquest on its mind was already inside their borders. So what actually happened here, stripped of blood eagles and martyrs' arrows and inflated troop counts? A force of a few thousand men landed on an East Anglian beach with no home to return to. Over roughly 5 years they took advantage of a kingdom's civil war, a king's decision to flee rather than fight, and the slow, grinding conquest of territory that had spent generations assuming raiders always eventually left. 3 kingdoms fell not primarily because Viking warriors were unstoppable, but because Anglo-Saxon Britain could not again and again unite quickly enough to stop them. Only one kingdom found a way to hold the line, and that story, the story of how Wessex survived what Northumbria, Mercia and East Anglia could not, is waiting for you already, told in full, in the video before this one. What remains when you strip away the sagas and the sainthood and the exaggerated numbers is a simpler and in some ways more unsettling truth. An island fell, one kingdom at a time, not because its enemies were monsters, but because it could never quite manage to stop fighting itself for long enough to fight them. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the myths corrected, the evidence weighed honestly, the pattern beneath the individual battles, there's another one waiting for you. Click it and walk with us further into the shadow.